Any of you who've read Glenn's writing on Salon know that he's not exactly your average political pundit. Glenn received his BA from George Washington University in 1990 and a JD from NYU Law School in 1994, after which he became a highly regarded constitutional litigator. He discontinued his practice in 2005 in order to focus more on his writing and other projects. He has since become one of the most influential voices in the media who speak out on the issues of civil liberties, foreign policy, transparency, and the role of American journalism. In an era rife with party loyalists who speak out against unrestrained government power only when the wrong party happens to be wielding it, Glenn has been a steadfast advocate of checks on government power throughout 2 presidential administrations. He is the author of 3 books, How Would a Patriot Act, Great American Hypocrites, and A Tragic Legacy. His writing, always biting and incisive, can be found at salon.com. We are very lucky to have him here, and please give a warm welcome to Glenn Greenwald.
Thank you. Good evening to everybody, and thank you so much for coming tonight, and thank you as well to Anti-War Action for sponsoring this event and for inviting me here. I'm really happy to be here. So what I'm here to talk about, according to the title that the event was given, is civil liberties in the age of Obama, or something similar to that. And one of the things that I always try to do, especially when time permits, whenever I'm talking about civil liberties, is to begin by talking first, or asking the question first, what are civil liberties? What is it that we even mean when we talk about civil liberties? And the reason I always like to begin that way is because civil liberties is one of those terms. There are so many in our political culture. I think terrorism is probably the leading example, but civil liberties is also one that's used pretty frequently, but is almost rarely defined, almost never defined. I think even people who write about civil liberties, who think about themselves as civil libertarians, would have a hard time telling you if you ask them what it is that we even mean when we refer to civil liberties. So before we can talk about civil liberties in the age of Obama and all the ways that Obama is waging an assault on civil liberties, I think it's a good idea for us to have an understanding of what those civil liberties mean and what we mean when we talk about them. So civil liberties is a pretty complex topic, but the term itself is fairly simple in what it designates. To me, civil liberties means nothing more than the list of things that the government is not permitted to do, or the list of powers that the government is barred from exercising when acting against you. And the reason why that's so significant is because, and it was significant, if you look at the debates the founders had, civil liberties and what it would be and what this list would entail was not just some side issue that got debated in an ancillary way. It was absolutely central to the debate over what the republic should be, what the Constitution ought to provide, how it ought to be designed, and it's not really that hard to understand why. The whole point of the American founding was that they had waged a revolution to emancipate themselves from a king who had very few of any restraints in his exercise of monarchical power. And the preoccupation of the founders, and especially the debate over whether or not there should be a federal union created, and no longer to allow the states to simply exist as autonomous entities, but instead to form a federal union, the preoccupation among those who were opposed to it and even those who were cautiously in favor of it was that by creating a federal government, a federal union, they would be empowering this entity that would end up replicating the tyranny of the British kings. And the argument that was made against that concern, the assurances that were given, was that the reason why that wasn't a danger, the reason why that wouldn't happen is because we were going to have this document that was going to list all the things that the government could not do no matter what. Even if majorities wanted it to, even if the circumstances were as dire as possible, this was going to be a list of lines that the government was barred from crossing. And by creating a list like that and enshrining it with supremacy, that would provide a guarantee that the dangers and tyrannies of the British king would be avoided. And if you look at these debates that they had over and over and over again, these civil liberties concerns were at the forefront of everything they debated. Issues of economic distribution of resources and domestic policy and other issues that often predominate today, those were the secondary concerns. The principal concern was, how do we ensure that the government does not become tyrannical and abusive? And the answer over and over was, we're going to have this list of powers that the government can't exercise no matter what, and those are what we mean by civil liberties. And one of the really good things about people who write about civil liberties, about writing about civil liberties, is that there's no real debate about what these civil liberties are. There's no guesswork involved in it. There's no debate over what should be included or what shouldn't be included. There's already a document that actually says exactly what they are. It just lists them. And that document, of course, is the Constitution in terms of first the Bill of Rights and then the amendments that follow. And you can look at this document and you see the entire universe of civil liberties from start to finish. So there's no ambiguity or uncertainty about what this list is. And that's one of the things that makes writing about civil liberties and defending civil liberties easier than defending other issues, is there's certainty and clarity with it. There's a couple of factors, a couple of attributes to this list of powers that the government can't exercise that distinguish it, in my view, from every other political debate, every other political controversy. There are certain attributes inherent in the concept of civil liberties as they've been consecrated by this document that make it completely different in nature from every other political conflict. The first one is that, unlike most political controversies, where all sorts of compromises are possible, if you look at how most political controversies get debated and how they're ultimately resolved, you have all kinds of competing factions with all sorts of conflicting interests, and ultimately they all get in a room together, or their representatives in Congress get in a room together with the lobbyists telling them what to say, and they all work out how these things are going to be resolved. And it's usually some kind of mishmash of all different positions, because that's what ultimately happens, is compromises are reached, and that's how majorities are assembled in order to approve new laws, new bills, new policies. The Constitution, the Bill of Rights, is exactly the opposite. There is no compromise permitted by the guarantees, by this list. They're absolute in terms of how they're expressed. And they're intended to be absolute. There are no exceptions to them. There are no compromises permitted. You just look at the text of almost every single right, and that's how it's expressed. So the First Amendment says, Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of speech, freedom of the press, free assembly. Or if you look at the Fourth Amendment, it says no warrant shall issue. No warrants, not most, no warrant shall issue except upon finding a probable cause. Or the people's rights to be secured against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated. And the Fifth Amendment says no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. You go down the list, and every single one of these are expressed as absolute propositions. There's no exceptions recognized or allowed. The minute you start recognizing exceptions, you're automatically permitting the government to cross the lines that it's not intended to cross. You know, you can debate the meaning of some of these terms. Some of the terms may be ambiguous. What is an unreasonable search and seizure? What should speech be? Is marching outside or having a sit-in in a park, is that a form of speech, or is it something else? You can have debates over the meaning of these terms, but what isn't debatable and what's not permissible is the introduction of exceptions. They're all absolute in their expression, in their guarantees. I once had this debate that became increasingly acrimonious, as some of my debates tend to, with Joe Klein of Time Magazine. And we were debating some civil liberties issue, I don't even remember what. And the more he started responding to what I was saying, the more insulting and name-calling he became. And at one point, I think like the fifth or sixth time, he said, well, in any event, Glenn Greenwald is a civil liberties absolutist. Or no, is a civil liberties extremist. That's what he called me, a civil liberties extremist. And I remember reading that, and I was genuinely confused because he kept insulting me throughout this entire exchange. And then I read that, and I said, you know, all of a sudden I said, why is he complimenting me? It's just so strange. Why is he like giving me this term of celebration and praise? And it took me actually a few seconds to realize that in his mind, civil liberties extremist was actually an insult. Like, it meant that you go too far in defense of civil liberties. And, you know, all you have to do is look at the language that's used that the document actually provides, and there is no other way to be a believer in civil liberties other than by being an extremist about it, because it itself is an extremist concept, and that distinguishes it from virtually every other political controversy where compromises are not only permissible but usually inevitable. The second attribute of civil liberties that distinguishes it from virtually every other political controversy is that civil liberties are by design anti-democratic. And what I mean by that is that whereas most political controversies are subject to the political vicissitudes of whatever political climate prevails or whatever mood prevails. If majorities believe one thing, politicians are likely to be responsive to that. If they believe something else, politicians are likely to do that. Certain referenda, certain measures require public opinion to be on their side in order to be enacted. Exactly the opposite is true for civil liberties. It doesn't matter, even if 95% of the public favors abridging certain speech because they find that speech so odious and repugnant and destructive, it makes not the slightest difference. The government is still barred from enacting laws that abridge free speech. Same with freedom of religion or creating a state religion or any of the other guarantees in the Constitution. Majoritarian opinion is absolutely irrelevant. In fact, it's not really that it's irrelevant, it's that majoritarian opinion is really one of the targets of the Constitution. The idea of the Bill of Rights and of these guarantees is that they're intended to constrict the ability of majorities to implement their policies. If their policies and what they favor entail a government transgressing these opinions, they're really designed to protect the minority from the majority. And in that sense, they're anti-democratic. It's why we don't have a pure democracy, but rather a republic, because the majority is not always permitted to get its way. They're barred from getting their way if what they support is a transgression of these limits. That's one of the reasons why it's always so bizarre whenever there's a Supreme Court opinion that ends up striking down a law that was enacted by a majority of citizens or by a majority of legislators, and then people, usually on the right, but now Democrats are starting to appropriate this language as well, will start to accuse the court of judicial activism on the grounds that they had the audacity to deny the majority its will, and to have unelected judges overturn laws enacted by the majority of the legislatures or the majority of citizens, as though that's something un-American, when the entire purpose of the Bill of Rights is to ensure that majorities will have their actions nullified in the cases where what the majority wants is contrary to what the Constitution guarantees. And it's not really hard to understand why that is. I mean, if you think about it, just take the First Amendment free speech clause. If you are a person who expresses a view that the majority likes, then by definition, you're not going to be a person who's targeted for censorship efforts because you're expressing views that the majority finds palatable. It's only those people who express opinions that are odious to the majority, that are offensive and repugnant, who are going to be targeted with censorship efforts. The same is true for imprisonment without due process. You can go throughout history and find in every case where civil liberties have been transgressed that the targets are always people who are disliked by the majority. Almost every free speech case where the government attempts to censor always entails people who are expressing opinions that are repugnant. There was just a recent Supreme Court case where the government, the federal government, attempted to enact legislation barring protests outside of funerals. Now, they knew when they did that that was a violation of free speech because they're preventing speech. It's a form of speech to protest the person who just died and to express the view that they were destructive and are going to burn in hell forever. As repugnant as that is, it's clearly speech. It's clearly an opinion. But what the government did is what they always do, which is they picked a person who they thought was so reprehensible that everybody would agree with the particularized application of this unconstitutional power, Fred Phelps. Who doesn't hate Fred Phelps? You can't find a single person who likes him. And so they purposely pick somebody like that because that's always the best way to institutionalize unconstitutional powers, is by selecting people about whom the majority doesn't care. And that's the whole purpose of the Constitution, is to protect the Fred Phelpses of the world, or neo-Nazis to march through Skokie even though there's large numbers of Holocaust survivors there, or communists in the 1950s who were depicted as the prime menace and yet, and therefore were constantly targeted for all sorts of suppression efforts. You go through history and you find in every case that what all kinds of unconstitutional acts always entail is the majority trying to target the minority in ways that the Constitution doesn't allow. And that's why the Constitution is anti-democratic, because the founders feared what they called the tyranny of the majority. The third attribute of the Constitution that distinguishes it from other features, other political conflicts is that it doesn't change ever, and it definitely doesn't change in times of war. You know, I had all kinds of debates about constitutional issues and actions of the Bush administration over the last 5 years, and invariably the argument always came down to, whenever there were people defending the radicalism of George Bush and Dick Cheney, that even though in general it would be nice if the government didn't do these things, in times of war we have to permit the government to do them. That in times of war the government's power increases and the citizenry's liberties diminish. And yet there actually isn't two sets of the Constitution, one for peacetime and one for wartime. And you can just read the Constitution to see that. I always used to ask every person who made this argument to just identify in the text where this particular right diminishes or is waived in times of war, and so far nobody's been able to identify that clause because it doesn't actually exist. War is always the rationale cited, or usually the rationale cited, for why these constitutional rights have to give way, or domestic social unrest. But there are no exceptions written into the Constitution, at least with regard to virtually every clause. Other political issues, people may change their views on how the government should or can behave in times of war and times of other crises, but the Constitution is universal in its application, and it was intended to be that way. You know, I would be a little bit more sympathetic to this argument that the Constitution magically transforms in times of war if the people who had written the Constitution never really had any experiences with war, and then you could make the argument that they probably just didn't anticipate that at some point we would be involved in some existential struggle for our existence and didn't take into account the need to have these rights be flexible. But the people who wrote this document were actually as familiar with war as we are, given that they had just waged one against the most powerful empire on earth. And so they were well aware that there would be all kinds of incidents in the nation's history when we would be involved in war, in very serious wars. And had they intended the Constitution to transform itself or to recede into the background or to give way at all in terms of the promises and guarantees that it makes during wartime, one would expect them to have said so. But either way, whether that expectation is fair or not, the reality is that they didn't say so, and the Constitution as a law just doesn't have any of these exceptions in it that all other policies have. And then the last distinguishing feature of the Constitution that I want to highlight that I think distinguishes it from all others is that there are all kinds of political controversies over certain rights and prerogatives that are distinguishable based on who is a citizen and who isn't. So, for example, if someone wants to enter the United States, if you're a citizen, you have the absolute right to enter the United States. You can't be denied entry. Whereas anyone who's not a citizen can be turned away at the border for any reason or no reason whatsoever. And that's not unique to the United States. That's typical for just about every country on the planet. And there are all kinds of issues like that about benefits that the government might issue, or you can have rational debates where you distinguish between the rights of citizens and the rights of non-citizens. Contrary to all sorts of popular belief and to the extremely deceitful and misleading statement of all kinds of politicians, the rights of the Constitution are not in any way dependent upon citizenship. You have people all the time making the following argument whenever it comes to things like due process for accused terrorists at Guantanamo or other things. You'll have senators all the time saying, why would you possibly want to give terrorists the same rights as U.S. citizens enjoy under the Constitution? And the premise of this claim is absolutely false. The premise is that the right not to be put into a cage without due process is one that the Constitution guarantees only to citizens. And yet if you read the Fifth Amendment, what it says is no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And it's true for just about every constitutional right. There are a couple, like the right to vote, that are confined to citizens, but every other constitutional right has nothing to do with whether the target of the government act is or is not a citizen. It is a restriction, as I said at the beginning, on what the government can do. And that's not just me saying that and the text that makes that clear. The Supreme Court, as much as 150 years ago, has said that, and they've said it over and over. There was the first case where a Chinese American in California was in the country legally but wasn't a citizen. And a city council passed a law basically depriving him of his job because he had engaged in some sort of protest that members of the city council didn't like and thought was improper for a non-citizen to engage in. Basically on the theory that he's lucky to be in this country, he's not a citizen, he shouldn't be engaged in this dissent, and therefore he's going to lose this job. And he sued and said that his right to property and other rights were being deprived without due process. And the argument of the city council and of the state was the argument that politicians continue to make, which is as a non-citizen, he doesn't have the right to not be deprived of property without due process or to invoke these other constitutional guarantees. These are for citizens only. And the Supreme Court unanimously read the Constitution and said that distinction is non-existent. The Constitution applies to all individuals, all human beings, under the authority of the U.S. government, meaning on U.S. soil or in territories that the U.S. government essentially exercises sovereign control, like Guantanamo. That was the argument of the Bush administration. They wanted to create a law-free zone in Guantanamo and make the argument that the Constitution only applies to citizens on U.S. soil, and the Supreme Court in the 2002 Roush case rejected that and said those kind of distinctions don't exist. It's not a document that guarantees rights to a certain group of people. It's a document that bars the exertion of power by the government regardless of the groups of people against whom it's exerting those powers. And that, too, is a critical distinction. Now, the other question that I always like to ask whenever I talk about civil liberties, other than what do we even mean when we talk about that term, is why is it worth caring about? Why do we care about civil liberties and civil liberties abridgments when they take place? And the reason why that question is worth asking is because there are a lot of people who think that the answer is we shouldn't care and we don't care. And the reason why many people take that position is because they think two things. They think, number one, that civil liberties abridgments are only directed at a group of people unlike them, and therefore they need not be concerned that those abridgments will ever be directed at them. And relatedly, number two, they think that those civil liberties abridgments are only directed at groups of people who generally deserve to have their rights abridged because they've done bad things. And that as long as you don't do bad things, then you have no reason to care. And what really underlies those two beliefs that then lead to this indifference towards civil liberties abridgment is the idea that most people, when they wake up in the morning, believe, because they've been told this from the time that they are children and have been told this fairly continuously without much dissent, that they live in a country, the United States, that is a free country. Not just the free country, the leader of the free world. And that they are fortunate to have the freedom to basically do whatever they want within limits, reasonable limits, and that the government doesn't really restrict them. And the reason why that's persuasive, other than because it's inculcated in them through repetition and through consensus, is because most people don't actually perceive that there are things that they want to do but are unable to do as a result of civil liberties abridgments. Most people who take this position, this indifference towards civil liberties, believe that in general, all the things that they want to do are things that they're allowed to do, and they feel relatively free. That's the premise that leads to this indifference. And so I think it's always critical, whether you're giving a speech on civil liberties or writing about them or talking about them to people or advocating for them, to address this mindset and because it's not, if you're not directly abridging somebody's civil liberties in a way that they perceive, if you're either abridging civil liberties only of a certain group of people but not them, or if you are abridging their civil liberties but somehow getting them not to perceive it, it is difficult to get people to understand why they ought to care. It's human impulse to care about things that affect you directly and not that are simply abstract injustices. And so this is always a critical topic to address. And there are lots of compelling reasons, I think, as to why it's worth caring about civil liberties, even if you're someone who thinks that yours aren't being infringed and aren't going to be. The first of which is that history leaves no doubt that although civil liberties infringements begin in a very confined way, directed at, as I said before, the most marginalized minorities about whom people don't care or to whom they direct their hostility, it is inevitable, absolutely inevitable, that those civil liberties abridgments, once they are entrenched, will spread. And they'll spread far beyond their original and intended targets. I always have this debate whenever free speech issues are raised. And there are lots of people, especially in Europe and Canada, but I think in the United States as well, who, for example, favor hate speech laws. The idea that although free speech in general is a good idea, that certain people who express ideas that are just so completely hateful that they actually become hurtful are ideas that the state can legitimately prohibit. And there's lots of prosecutions in Canada and Europe and elsewhere of people who express ideas that the society finds odious, whether it's insulting views about homosexuals or about Muslims, or in other countries about certain other religions, who then end up being prosecuted for these opinions. And the people who defend those prosecutions and these abridgments take the position that, well, these particular opinions are so hateful, so extreme, that we ought to abridge them. There was just a case this week where there was basically a riot, a week-long riot in Afghanistan, where dozens of people were murdered because Muslims in Afghanistan were so angry about the burning of the Quran by this pastor in Florida. And it led to politicians in both parties calling for formal action to punish Quran burning, even though Quran burning is every bit as much the expression of political opinion as, say, burning the American flag or burning a president in effigy or tearing up the picture of the Pope, as Sinead O'Connor famously did on Saturday Night Live. There are lots of symbolic acts like that that generate all kinds of intense rage and hostility that are nonetheless expressions of free speech and free opinion that the Constitution doesn't allow to be banned. But this Pastor Jones Act was so repulsive and created so much turmoil and ultimately led to the deaths of lots of people that a lot of people just instinctively began to be receptive to the idea that that was one case where actually maybe it would be okay to punish him for the speech that he expressed because of how foreseeable it was that it would lead to harm. And the problem with that is what I just said, which is what you're really doing when you assent to that idea or to any civil liberties abridgment is you're not actually endorsing the idea that the government has the right to punish people who burn the Quran. What you're actually endorsing is the idea that the government has the right to compile lists of prohibited ideas that can be punished if you begin to express them. And it may be that this list of prohibited ideas begins as a list that you're basically comfortable with because you think those ideas are really pernicious. But once that list starts to get compiled, it will inevitably spread far beyond what you think it ought to be. And ultimately, and I think somewhat deservedly, will probably end up including many of the ideas that the people who wanted the list in the first place actually believe in and would like to express. And so that's the problem with endorsing civil liberties abridgments and we're not caring about them when they're confined to minorities, is eventually they spread and proliferate, and if you're somebody who endorsed them at the beginning, you have no principled basis for opposing their expansion. The second reason that civil liberties abridgments are crucial to care about, even if they're not being directed towards a particular person or in a way that this person cares about, is that what happens when the government is permitted in certain instances to cross these lines that were supposed to be sacrosanct is that a climate of fear ends up being created in the citizenry. And that climate of fear means that people on their own start relinquishing and repudiating their own rights because they now fear the government. And there actually ends up being a process of self-censorship where people refrain from exercising rights because of this fear, and then they convince themselves that these weren't rights that they really want to exercise in the first place, and that's what leads to that mindset that I talked about, that people wake up in the morning and think, well, there's nothing that I really want to do that I'm being restricted from doing, and therefore I don't think there's really a problem. I actually have a couple examples I want to briefly recount that I think underscores this dynamic. It's something that I actually realized only fairly recently, but I think it's pretty significant in terms of why civil liberties abridgments are so harmful. I've written a lot about WikiLeaks and the WikiLeaks controversy, and have defended them fairly steadily and regularly over the last year or so in lots of different contexts. But the first time I ever wrote about WikiLeaks was probably, I believe it was in January of 2010, a little bit more than a year ago. And this was at a time when very few people had actually heard of WikiLeaks. They hadn't really released any of the newsworthy items that made them so famous throughout the year. It was even before they released the video in Baghdad showing the U.S. military murdering multiple unarmed civilians and journalists. They had released a lot of documents relating to other countries, corporations, and the like, but they really weren't very well known in the United States. In fact, I hadn't heard about them at the time, and what made them be in the news at the time and what led me to write about them was that the Pentagon in 2008 had written a secret report that ironically and unsurprisingly was leaked to WikiLeaks, which then published it, that was about why WikiLeaks is an enemy of the state. And this Pentagon report talked about ways that WikiLeaks should be destroyed and ways they could destroy WikiLeaks. They talked about manufacturing fictitious documents and submitting them to WikiLeaks in the hope that WikiLeaks would then release them, and then they would be accused of publishing false documents, and that would destroy their credibility. Or they talked the way that happened with Dan Rather. Or they talked about invading their internet security and uncovering the identity of their sources so that people would no longer be willing to leak to WikiLeaks. And it literally talked about how WikiLeaks was an enemy of the state. And I didn't really know much about WikiLeaks at the time, but I knew that if the Pentagon was preparing secret reports about how to destroy them, that this was a group that merited a lot more scrutiny and probably a lot of support. That's all I knew about them, but at least for me at the time, that was enough to make me interested in them and view them favorably. And so I started reading more about them and actually saw what it was that they had been doing, which was leaking all sorts of documents about the world's most powerful factions and preventing them from engaging in deceitful and wrongful acts in the dark. So even by this point, they had released all kinds of documents showing the involvement of Kenyan political officials in death squads. They had released documents showing toxic waste dumping by large corporations in Western Africa with the complicity of government officials. There were attempts in Australia to empower the government to shut down websites on the ground that these websites were involved in child pornography, and yet the list of websites that were to be targeted by the Australian government involved all sorts of sites that had nothing to do with pornography but had been opposing the government in all sorts of ways. They had released documents showing the involvement of political officials in Iceland in the financial collapse in 2008 and their awareness of the problems that these banks had, but their unwillingness to act because of their closeness to the banks. A whole slew of corrupt acts that had been kept secret that WikiLeaks released. And so at the time, I actually started to get a sense for why WikiLeaks could be a really valuable and vital tool in subverting the regime of secrecy behind which the world's most powerful factions operate. And so that's really what led me to write about them that first time. And I interviewed Julian Assange at the time, and I wrote a fairly long article about what WikiLeaks was doing, why they were important in the war that the Pentagon was waging against them. And at the end of this piece, I had suggested and recommended that people donate money to WikiLeaks, because at the time they had said that they had a lot of leaks that they hadn't been able to process because they lacked resources and lacked the staff needed to verify these documents, and other needs that they had for funding. And I suggested that people donate to WikiLeaks. And in response to this suggestion, and I provided some links and the like, there were not a couple of people, but a lot of people, readers of mine, people who I know to be not prone to conspiratorial thinking, but very sober and rational, who said to me in all sorts of ways, by email, in person, in the comment section of my blog, who said the following: I agree entirely with what you said about WikiLeaks and their potential for doing good. And I wish that they would get all the support they need, and I would love to be able to donate money to WikiLeaks, but my concern is that if I donate money to WikiLeaks, especially online or in any other way, that I'm going to end up on some sort of list somewhere, some kind of a government list, and that eventually, given that WikiLeaks has been declared to be an enemy of the state by the Pentagon and is viewed that way and could start releasing secret U.S. documents, they had released a couple, but not very many, but that they could in the future, that at some point I might even be exposed to some kind of liability, criminal liability, of aiding and abetting or giving material support to a terrorist organization, if they're so designated. Now, I didn't really consider those concerns particularly valid because there was really no, strictly speaking, legal basis for bringing that kind of a claim. But the fact that so many people had expressed that fear, and so many people who are knowledgeable and rational and sober people had expressed it, really underscored for me how intense this climate of fear and intimidation is that the U.S. government has created over the last decade. Because here were people, U.S. citizens, who wanted to donate money to a group who had never been charged with any crime, let alone convicted of any crime, wanted to donate money to a group whose political objectives and political actions they agreed with enthusiastically, which is about as core of a First Amendment right as you could possibly find, the right of freedom of association, the right of free speech, which is what donating money to political groups like political candidates has been declared to be. And yet, here were a large number of people purposely and deliberately and consciously refraining from exercising their constitutional rights out of fear that one day they might end up on a government list. And ultimately, it probably turned out that their fears were more valid than I've suggested, since as WikiLeaks began releasing more documents that the United States government didn't want released, there have been an escalation of claims and arguments and suggestions that WikiLeaks is akin to a terrorist organization, that they ought to be prosecuted for espionage. There have been efforts by the U.S. government to persecute people associated with WikiLeaks or who support them, people who work with WikiLeaks, U.S. citizens. Every time they re-enter the country are now routinely stopped at their border and have their laptops seized without any search warrant and the contents of their laptop copied. There were Twitter subpoenas sent out by the U.S. government to invade the Twitter accounts of a whole variety of associates and supporters of WikiLeaks. And so what you have when the government starts exercising powers that they were not supposed to exercise is that this climate of fear gets created where people avoid exercising their own rights. There's one more anecdote that I want to convey that I think underscores the same thing, that might even be more significant than the one that I just described, which is, in the course of writing about WikiLeaks over the past year, I've come to talk to and get to know a large number of people who work with WikiLeaks or who used to work with WikiLeaks. And what every single one of them will tell you, the people who no longer work with WikiLeaks or the people who now work with WikiLeaks but are strongly considering stopping, which is almost every single one of them, is they will say the following, and these are usually people who are citizens of other countries, largely Western European countries and Australia, is they'll say, I wholeheartedly support what WikiLeaks is doing. I passionately believe, as much as I've ever believed in them before, what it is that WikiLeaks is doing. But the reason either I've stopped working with them or I'm seriously considering it is because what I fear is not that one day my government is going to accuse me of engaging in criminal conduct. I'm perfectly comfortable with handling that situation and confronting it because I'll hire a lawyer and I'll use the due process that will be afforded to me, and I don't think I've done anything wrong, and I'm confident that in my country's judicial system I will be exonerated. And so I'm not worried that my government's going to be accusing me of crimes. What I'm worried about is that the government one day will knock on my door and say that we have a request from the United States to extradite you to their country to prosecute you for these crimes, and that you're going to be extradited to the United States. Because what they've seen over the last decade and continue to see is that the U.S. government, when it comes to especially foreign nationals accused of endangering the security of the United States, operates without any constraints whatsoever. They put people into cages for life without so much as charging them with a crime, not giving them an opportunity to get into a court. They literally disappear them for years, and did that during the Bush years, into secret camps that not even the Red Cross can monitor, that nobody knows about. They torture people. They act without constraints. And so it's really quite extraordinary, if you think about it, that the greatest fear that people around the world now have is ending up in the grips of the U.S. justice system. The justice system that for decades we held up as the model for how to be free, that we lectured other countries that they ought to replicate if they want to be a civilized first world country that's civilized and honors and Western norms of justice. The great fear that people have is ending up in that judicial system. And I think that really underscores the key point of what's taking place in the United States in the last 10 years with regard to civil liberties, which is, if you look at what people will say about things like torture and rendition and disappearing people, is people have a hard time understanding what the purpose of that is. I mean, if you ask every interrogation expert, they'll tell you that torturing doesn't work. It leads to false confessions. You more readily and easily get information by establishing a rapport with the target of your interrogation. Disappearing people does nothing but bring the United States into ill repute. It's very hard to understand what the purpose of all of that was. But what the real purpose of it was is the purpose that I just described happening with these lesser examples, which is to purposely create a climate of fear and intimidation so that the signal that is sent to everybody around the world and to U.S. citizens is that we political authorities in the United States can act without constraint. If we think that you are challenging us or dissenting from what we want or impeding our objectives and our will in any meaningful way, what we can do to you is limitless. They know, for example, that they cannot ever really stop leaks of classified information given the technologies that exist. Even if they succeed in imprisoning Julian Assange for life and destroying WikiLeaks, it's easy overnight to create 25 more WikiLeaks or 1,000 more WikiLeaks. There will be other more innovative ways to facilitate leaks and to ensure that classified information is disseminated. They know they can't really put a stop to that. So what they're trying instead to do is to say, you can do this. You will have the ability to do this. We can't stop you from doing it. But if you do it, we'd like you to take a look over there at Bradley Manning, who's being kept in solitary confinement for 10 straight months after being convicted of absolutely nothing and stripped nude and treated in the most degrading and inhumane manner possible. Or we'd like you to look at the whistleblowers who exposed all kinds of government waste and government fraud and the way in which we, the Obama administration, are now prosecuting them more aggressively than any administration in history. And the signal that's being sent is, if you are somebody who discovers anything that we've done that's deceitful or illegal or wasteful or wrong, that we've done in secret, and you're thinking about publicizing it, you ought to think twice, because what we can do to you is completely limitless. We can act in ways that we're not supposed to act, that the Constitution says we shouldn't be able to act, and nobody can do anything about it, and nobody will object. That's what the torture regime was about. That's what putting people into shackles and orange jumpsuits and showing the world what we've done to them was about. It's what Abu Ghraib was about. It's what disappearing people is about. It's always the same objective when the government transgresses civil liberties. It's a way of signaling that you had best not oppose or challenge or dissent from our power. And that's why, even if you're not a particular person whose civil liberties are being infringed and you're not targeted by this, there's still very good reason to care when the government does it, because you shouldn't want a government that intimidates other citizens out of exercising the rights that they're supposed to have. Last point I want to make about why civil liberties infringements are crucial to care about, even if you're not being directly targeted by them, or if you think that the only people who are people who deserve it, is that there's one proposition that I think history demonstrates fairly conclusively, I would even say indisputably, which is that there really is no such thing as legitimate certainty. By which I mean that it's always the case in every single society that there are certain opinions, certain propositions that are deemed to be unquestionably true. And then there are other propositions that are always deemed to be unquestionably false. And the ones that are deemed unquestionably false are the ones that you're simply not permitted to express and that have traditionally been punished if they have been expressed. And what always happens, not sometimes, not usually, not most of the time, what always happens to every society is that certain opinions that they believe to be indisputably correct turn out to be completely erroneous, even evil. And certain opinions that they believe to be indisputably erroneous and pernicious turn out to be absolutely right. And nobody, as a result, should be so hubristic that they believe that certainty is warranted or legitimate when it comes to empowering the government to ban certain opinions, empowering the government to imprison certain people who just seem definitely guilty without due process. This certainty is completely unwarranted by even a casual review of history. And that is ultimately what civil liberties are about, is preventing the government from exerting power without checks that are necessary to prevent these kind of errors. So we accepted the idea that it was okay to put huge numbers of Muslims into cages without due process, because even those of us who kind of thought it wasn't the right thing to do deep down believed that these people were probably guilty, because where there's smoke, there's fire. that we didn't just pluck them off the street randomly, that they probably, if not being the kind of terrorist mastermind that they might have been accused of being, probably on some level were kind of guilty of something and therefore belong there. And it may be objectionable in theory, but not really passionately wrong that they were being imprisoned without due process. And yet, as it turns out, the vast majority of them, people who spent time in Guantanamo, have turned out to be guilty of absolutely nothing. Colin Powell's chief of staff, Lawrence Wilkerson, said that not only were the majority of them guilty of nothing, that the Bush administration knew they were guilty of nothing, but kept them there anyway to prevent the realization that they were imprisoning innocent people and to prevent the people at Guantanamo from publicizing what had been done to them. And ever since the Supreme Court in 2008 said that Guantanamo detainees had the right to habeas corpus review, the right to get into a court and ask a court to review the circumstances and validity of their detention, the Obama administration went in each one of these cases and told the court, we have overwhelming evidence that these people are terrorists and that they belong in Guantanamo. The Obama administration announced, just like the Bush administration announced, that there's no reason to worry about the lack of due process at Guantanamo. These are the worst of the worst. And yet when courts finally were allowed to review the actual so-called evidence against the people who were there, the evidence justifying the accusations, the courts found in 75% of the cases, that's the current statistic, that there was no credible evidence to justify their detention. And many of them had been in prison for 5, 6, 7, and 8 years with what our own courts found were no credible evidence. And these were the people about whom the government was saying are the absolutely, clearly, unquestionably guilty ones, the worst of the worst. Certainty is not something that anybody should believe exists. That's why all people, but especially people with power, and the more power, the more this is true, need checks, need scrutiny, need accountability. And ultimately, that's what civil liberties are designed to do. So even if you think the government is acting correctly in a certain case and are therefore willing to acquiesce to the transgression of civil liberties, the mere fact that certainty is never warranted by itself ought to lead you to find that objectionable. So the last point I want to cover is the state of civil liberties in the age of Obama, now that we've talked about what these civil liberties are and why we should care about them. I don't think it's particularly controversial at this point to make the following observation, which is that the core of the George Bush, Dick Cheney template for the war on terror was something that Barack Obama continuously, repeatedly, and vehemently condemned when he was a senator and then when he was a candidate. And yet that very same architecture, the crux of that architecture, is something that Barack Obama has enthusiastically and on virtually every level come to embrace. I don't mean that he's failed to reverse it or that he just hasn't been fast enough about undoing it. I mean that he's embraced it enthusiastically. It used to be that when I would say that, back in 2009, it was like some kind of bizarre heresy. And people just found it inconceivable that I would even think about comparing George Bush and Barack Obama. And of course, Robert Gibbs famously said that anybody who would ever compare George Bush to Barack Obama in any way is somebody who needs psychiatric help. That was in his rant against the professional left. And yet now, 2 short years later, I think it's pretty much of a consensus that Obama has replicated all of those policies. When I used to say that, I used to spend most of my time proving it by going through case after case after case. I no longer feel a need to do that because I think it's fairly well established that that's the case. And one of the points that I think is so critical to make about this is that for a while it seemed like the problem with that Barack Obama had embraced every single one of the George Bush policies with a couple of exceptions, but essentially the fundamental architecture of it. The problem with it was not only that he swore over and over and over when running for president that he would undo it and then did exactly the opposite. That is a problem, but that's not the problem that I think is the critical problem. And the problem is not that these heinous policies that 50% of the country, which calls themselves Democrats and progressives, pretended for all those years to find so horrible and objectionable, now suddenly seem fairly complacent and content with it all. That too is a problem, but that's not the huge problem that I'm about to talk about. And it's also not the problem that these policies that are in fact oppressive and dangerous as civil liberties abridgments for all the reasons that I've just talked about are continuing. though that too is true. The huge problem is that it used to be the case prior to January 20th, 2009, that there was a very spirited debate about these issues. There was at least the pretext, the pretense of divisiveness, because all of these policies, like indefinite detention, putting people into cages and denying them the right to have habeas corpus, claiming that even allegedly illegal acts on the part of the executive are state secrets so vital that no courts can examine what they are. All of these ideas, and especially the idea that the war on terror is an actual war in which the battlefield is not any finite physical space, but is the entire planet, so that the president can exert war powers anywhere at any time without any limitations. All of those premises that were the defining premises of George Bush's and Dick Cheney's radicalism used to be the subject of extensive divisiveness and debate because they were considered to be radical right-wing Republican policies. And Democrats constantly claimed that they objected to all of these things. Military commissions, creating new founded tribunals to convict people instead of using our regular justice system. All of these things, you had Republicans on one side arguing in favor of it. You had Democrats on the other side going on television and talking about how it was wrong. You had John McCain in the presidential campaign defending it. You had Barack Obama standing up and saying that they were unnecessary and counterproductive and wrong and vowing to undo it. So you had a debate, or the appearance of a debate, over these issues. And what Barack Obama's embrace of these policies has done, that I think is the most significant and most disturbing effect of his doing this, is that he has taken all of these policies that not long ago were the province of right-wing radicalism, and he's converted them into bipartisan consensus. And the reason why that's so disturbing is because policies that become bipartisan consensus are removed, usually forever, from the realm of mainstream debate. Because in our country, political debates have limits, and the limits are usually defined by what Republicans and Democrats talk about. And if Republicans and Democrats disagree on a certain issue, those issues will make it into political discourse. But once the leaders of the Republican and Democratic parties agree on a certain proposition, those get removed from things that the media will cover and that people debate. And that happened in the run-up to the Iraq War, for example. If you ask journalists to this day why the media didn't more aggressively scrutinize claims about weapons of mass destruction, what they'll tell you, almost all of them, is that the Bush administration would make these claims and most Democratic leaders wouldn't contest them. There was no Democrat calling these reporters and saying, hey, what he's saying isn't true. And so this reveals this mindset that these reporters have, that once Democrats and Republicans agree on a certain issue, it's removed from the realm of consideration or debate, even for journalists. It's taken off the table. It no longer is part of our political discourse. It becomes an embedded and entrenched attribute of American political policy. And there's actually lots of historical examples where that's true. If you look at what happened in World War II and Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal legislation, this whole New Deal administrative state that was created during the Roosevelt administration and then continued during the Truman administration used to be the target of the most vicious attacks by Republicans that opposed it as socialism and incursions, improper incursions by the state. And then what happened is when Dwight Eisenhower was elected president, the first Republican president after Roosevelt and Truman, instead of undoing it and dismantling it, he actually just tinkered with it and maintained it, and in some cases actually expanded it. And then it became not the policy any longer of Democrats, but the policy of Democrats and Republicans, and that was no longer debated. It just endured forever. And the same thing happened with Lyndon Johnson's Great Society reforms, that during the 1960s, Goldwater conservatives in the Republican Party railed against continuously, until Richard Nixon became president and basically continued the Great Society institutions, or certainly didn't dismantle them, and then the debate went away and those persisted. And this is exactly now what's happening with George Bush and Dick Cheney's assault on civil liberties. Because Barack Obama has embraced them, the problem is not merely that they're continuing, it's that they have become even stronger as a result of now assuming the mantle of bipartisan consensus, of harmony, of being removed from the realm of debate. So what you see is former Bush officials like Jack Goldsmith, who is this extreme right-wing ideologue who used to work in the Bush Justice Department. He was the person who endorsed the legality of the criminal NSA program, who has written an article in the New Republic about 9 months ago saying that Barack Obama did more than George Bush and Dick Cheney could ever have done to entrench these terrorism policies and these civil liberties policies in the American body politic by having Congress endorse them, but mostly by making them bipartisan. And you see something else even more remarkable, which is Republicans almost instinctively love to accuse Democrats of being soft on terror or being untrustworthy on national security. And this was the attack that people like Bill Kristol and Liz Cheney and others, and Dick Cheney, launched on Barack Obama for the first few months of his presidency. He's going to trigger a terrorist attack because he's no longer torturing people. That was the attack. But it has become so glaringly obvious, so obvious and indisputable, that rather than jettisoning those policies, Obama has actually continued them, and in some cases, even expanded them beyond where Bush went, by, for example, asserting the power to target American citizens for assassination without a shred of due process, literally being the judge, jury, and executioner. That even people like Dick Cheney and Bill Kristol can no longer, with a straight face, claim that Barack Obama is being soft on terrorism and national security by abandoning Bush-Cheney policies, because he's not abandoning those policies. And even our standards of permissive truth abandonment in our political discourse doesn't allow that level of falsehood that Barack Obama has abandoned these policies. And so what they've done is they've switched tactics, and they now not only acknowledge that he's continuing them, but they praise him for it, and they claim, I think quite rightly, a measure of vindication, that it proves that Democrats all along didn't really believe the criticisms they were voicing that George Bush was shredding the Constitution. They were saying these things opportunistically for partisan gain, and that now Obama, now that he's not a senator anymore, now that he's not a candidate anymore, now that he's president and responsible for protecting the nation, now that he has access to national security, actually sees that all along George Bush and Dick Cheney were right. Because that's a pretty fair conclusion to reach from the fact that he went from criticizing those policies to embracing them as his own. And I once wrote, and I think it's true, that Barack Obama actually won the debate on the war on terror. The problem is that he actually won the debate for the Republicans by adopting these policies as the Democratic Party's policies and therefore enshrining them forever. So that's where I think the state of civil liberties is in the age of Obama and the war on terror. It's not a particularly optimistic or sunny picture, for which I apologize, but it's not actually my fault. But that, I think, actually is where things stand. And I think there are lots of reasons why we ought to care about that. And I talked about those at the beginning, and it's the reason why I continue to focus on them, even though lots of people seem somewhat indifferent, especially now that both parties are doing it. So with that, I will conclude, and thank you very much for listening. And I guess we'll have a question and answer session. Is that correct?
Yeah, one quick announcement. We neglected to do this, but Anti-War Action would like to thank all the groups that really helped a lot to support us in making this talk possible. I'd like to thank the Brown ACLU, the International Socialist Organization, the Rhode Island Mobilization Committee to Stop War and Occupation, the American Civilization Department, and the Undergraduate Financing Board. Outside, we do have information about how to support WikiLeaks and a donation box for Bradley Manning's Defense Fund. So please try to contribute to that. In fact, some of us have been actually writing postcards to Bradley Manning's to try keeping up his spirits. We have information about how to do that. So please consider stopping by at the table. And we also have one copy, the only one we could get our hands on, of Glenn Greenwald's latest book. So the first person to buy that gets it. Okay, thank you.
So I guess there are microphones here and here for whoever has questions, and we can have a dialogue.
I have
Yep.
two quick questions.
Okay.
The first is, where do these so-called war powers of the government come from? And the second is, what would it take for us to improve the fate of civil liberties in the future?
Yeah, those are two really good questions. I mean, the war powers in the Constitution are pretty clearly spelled out. And Article 1, Section 8 says that the power to declare war rests with the Congress, which means, I think, that at the very least, the president has no right to start a war unless Congress declares a war by voting on it after a debate. Or at least, at the very least, it means that the president can't start wars on his own without some kind of democratic process. And I have really good support, in my view, for that, which is the 2008 incarnation of Barack Obama, who, when asked by the Boston Globe when he was running for president whether or not George Bush would have the right to bomb Iran without congressional approval, he said, absolutely not. Presidents don't have the right to start wars without congressional approval unless the United States is under an attack or imminently about to be under an attack. And of course, he just launched this war on Libya with about the least amount of democratic discussion, let alone congressional action, I think, that's ever taken place with regard to a war that wasn't covert. So the Constitution is pretty clear about how wars get started, and it's pretty much the opposite of how this last one just got started. As far as civil liberties, how to basically mobilize citizens, one of the things that is interesting is that when you actually look at polls about civil liberties questions, you find much more support, much more substantial support than is generally assumed. I remember early on when I started writing about political issues in 2005, one of the first controversies was that it was revealed that the Bush administration was spying on Americans without the warrants required by law. It was basically committing felonies. And the consensus in the media and among Democratic politicians was that this was a losing political issue, that Democrats shouldn't object, they shouldn't even stand up and say, you know, there's this 30-year-old law that says that if you do this, it's a crime and a felony, and they kind of got caught doing exactly that, and that's not really a good thing. The consensus was that Democrats should run away from this because people wouldn't care if the government was eavesdropping without warrants, even though the law says you have to. And polls almost immediately taken in the aftermath of that revelation showed that something like 60% of Americans thought that it was the wrong thing to do, that investigations were needed. The same thing happened when there was the question of whether the Bush administration, the Obama administration, should investigate and prosecute Bush officials for torture and eavesdropping crimes. The consensus in the media class was this would be a political loser for Obama to do. Nobody wants this. And yet poll after poll after poll showed roughly 60% believe that those investigations were warranted. And so I think the reason why Americans do care more about civil liberties than people generally assume is because we're inculcated from childhood in believing that one of the reasons why we're such a great and wonderful nation and such a free nation is because of these protections. You know, I remember being taught when I was 6 that in those bad other countries the government can throw you in jail just because the leaders want to, but in the United States they can't unless they convict you of a crime. These are things that we're taught to value and that we instinctively value. The only time polls start showing indifference towards civil liberties abridgments or support for them is when both political parties start supporting them, and then the debate disappears. And people just assume that if both the Republicans and the Democrats believe that this is a good thing to do, then it must be a good thing to do. So I think the key to civil liberties protections is to remove them from the realm of partisan politics, because otherwise what happens is Democrats care about them when there's a Republican in office, Republicans care about the Constitution when there's a Democrat in office, but otherwise it's just a standstill. There's actually lots of room for cross-partisan and cross-ideological alliances on the issue of civil liberties. And you see that even now with the Republicans suddenly expressing concern about starting wars without congressional approval. You saw with the Patriot Act vote that a lot of the Tea Party members joined with the most liberal members of Congress in opposing the extension of the Tea Party. The problem is that all our political debates take place in the context of Republican versus Democrats, and then things just become automatically polarized because people know which side they're on, and that's what determines the view that they adopt. Yep.
So you said early on that you felt that civil liberties unions issues, are uncomplicated, but I'm not sure that I agree, because I think sometimes complicated readings are necessary to protect civil liberties. I mean, I'm thinking particularly of abortion in this country. I mean, I agree with the argument voiced in Roe v. Wade that there's a comprehensive vision of the Bill of Rights implies a right to privacy, and that right to privacy covers a woman and her doctor, and that means that a woman should have the right to abortion on demand. And so, I just wonder if maybe that's not a reductive way of looking at it, because some of these rights aren't enumerated. I mean, there's no constitutional amendment that provides for the sovereignty over one's own body, for example.
Right. No, I agree with you completely. I mean, I think actually what I said, or if I didn't, what I intended to say or express is that what's not complicated is what we mean by civil liberties, which is the list of things that the government can't do. And that they're absolute in their nature. So once they exist, then they cannot be waived. I agree entirely, and I think I said that there are debates possible in terms of the meaning of some of these rights. So, for example, you can have debates about what an unreasonable search and seizure is. You can have debates about what the right of privacy entails, whether there is an actual right of privacy in the Constitution, since it doesn't explicitly say that there is. I don't think that's a very interesting debate. I think the answer is pretty clear, but you can have debates at least about what that right encompasses. So you're right, a lot of civil liberties issues are complicated because they entail reasonable debates about what some of these terms mean. And the reason for that is the founders deliberately made the Constitution somewhat broad. They're aspirational in nature. They express general principles. It's not a regulatory code because they didn't want to in advance try and anticipate every single potential controversy. And so what they are their principles that say the government cannot exert this generalized type of power. And of course, then there'll be debates about how that general principle applies to a particular situation. What I was saying is simple and absolute is that once there is a right established, that right cannot give way to political exigencies or debates of majoritarian will or anything of that nature. Yep.
I guess my question is, are there any appropriate limits on freedom of speech when it comes to national security matters? I think most reasonable people would agree that a military officer cannot leak any single piece of military information at all. What I'm wondering is how far does that outer bound go, and why is Bradley Manning being prosecuted inappropriately?
Right. Well, I mean, one of the interesting things is that I don't really think that there are people who contest the prosecution of Bradley Manning on legalistic grounds. If you talk to Daniel Ellsberg, for example, what he will say to you is that when he leaked the Pentagon Papers, knew that what he was doing was illegal, and that he expected to go to prison for life for doing it, but that he could no longer in good conscience conceal this information and allow this war to continue. And the only reason why he didn't end up being prosecuted was because the misconduct of the Nixon administration was so great. But he will not tell you that what he did was legal or that he shouldn't have been prosecuted for it. What makes those kinds of acts courageous is precisely that there are consequences to them. That's what civil disobedience is. Martin Luther King, when he broke the law, didn't say, you shouldn't put me in prison. He said, you should put me in prison where I want to go to illustrate the injustices against which I'm fighting. So, I think, it's not really an issue of freedom of speech. If you go to work for a private corporation and you sign a contract vowing not to disclose their trade secrets to the world and you go and do it, they can sue you because you've breached the commitment that you've undertaken voluntarily. So when you enter the military, you voluntarily undertake the commitment to safeguard classified information. So as a purely legalistic matter, it's not really a free speech issue. It becomes a free speech issue when you start talking about prosecuting groups that have not taken that obligation, such as WikiLeaks or the New York Times or private citizens. And that's the reason why there hasn't been any prosecutions ever in this country of private citizens or private actors leaking classified information. Only government officials or people in the military, because it's a voluntary act.
Can you mind if I follow up on that?
Yep.
All right. So I think I and pretty much any reasonable people would agree that the government's treatment of Bradley Manning has been horrific. But in terms of the actual substance of what he did as a military officer leaking information, do you think that do you think that there is a legal case against them? Do you think there should be a legal case against him? And I guess my other question that I meant to sort of articulate but maybe did a bad job is, people probably agree that if a reporter leaks the exact, location of, military bases, highly sensitive information that could, that's not, revealing government committing crimes, just important information that can endanger lives, that's wrong. On the other hand, if you're revealing, a massacre, that's obviously correct. Where do you think the line is there? So those are the two questions I kind of meant to ask.
Right. Well, I mean, the issue, for me, the issue with Bradley Manning is that if you actually look at what purports to be the chat that he had with Adrian Lamo that was turned over to the government that resulted in his detection, he said in that chat log pretty much what I just attributed to Daniel Ellsberg, which is that he knew that what he was doing was against the law, that could send him to prison for life. And he talked about, just like Ellsberg did, the reasons why he did it anyway and was willing to risk that, because he felt like the injustices that he had discovered were so extreme that he could not in good conscience cooperate in their concealment, and that he believed that disclosure would lead to critical reforms, or at least he hoped they would. And interestingly, there's a good case to be made that he actually did help to trigger some of the most important reforms of the last century, I would say, which is the democratic uprisings in the Middle East, where at least several of the uprisings, including the one in Tunisia, was enabled in part by some of the cables that were released by WikiLeaks that Bradley Manning allegedly gave to them that showed the corruption of these regimes. So, it's a hard question to answer, because legalistically, if you were to say to me, do I think Bradley Manning should be immune from prosecution because what he did is, in my view, heroic? The reason why I find that suggestion a little bit disturbing is because it's somewhat redolent to me of what Bush defenders used to say in defense of that lawbreaking, which was, yes, it may be the case that eavesdropping on Americans without warrants technically is illegal, but they were doing it to prevent terrorist plots and to keep us safe. And so because good outcomes were the result, or at least were the intended result, we should forgive that lawbreaking. And that can't be how the rule of law functions. The rule of law means that once we, as a majority, through the democratic process, decide that certain things are prohibited, and that's a legitimate decision, that those ought to be abided by. The problem that I have with the Bradley Manning prosecution is not on legalistic grounds. It's that it is so unbelievably selective. You can pick up the newspaper every single day, and what you will read is Obama officials anonymously told us something that is intended to be classified. Every single year, Bob Woodward makes millions of dollars by going around every little office in the White House and basically telling people that if you give me the secrets that I want, I will depict you favorably in my books, and if you deny me the information I want, I will malign you in my books. And he is the recipient of all kinds of classified information, none of which is ever prosecuted. So these prosecutions really don't have anything to do with the rule of law. Bradley Manning's being prosecuted not because he did anything that was illegal or because he released information that caused harm. It didn't. Bradley Manning's being prosecuted because he released information that embarrassed the United States government and exposed its deceit and corruption. And if the law under which he was being convicted were being applied equally, if pro-government leakers were being prosecuted with this kind of vigor or at all, I would have much less of a problem with it. I think it's a political prosecution, even though strictly as a legalistic matter, Bradley Manning did probably break the law if, in fact, he did what he's accused of doing. Yep.
Yeah. Early on when you were talking about civil liberties, how they're defined and things like that, you kind of implied through a couple of your examples that the Supreme Court is like one of the ways that this could be decided, but isn't the Supreme Court itself rather politicized? I mean, aren't there people in like...
The Supreme Court's politicized? No. No, I understand your point. I mean, you're right. Look, I mean, ultimately, when there are disputes about what the Constitution means, unless there's a deity that descends from the sky that generously offers to resolve it, human beings are going to have to resolve the dispute. There is no other way to resolve subjective disputes other than by gathering human beings together and giving them certain rules that you hope they will abide by to ensure integrity in the process. And so, of course, the Supreme Court is politicized, and of course many of their decisions are politically motivated. And so there are decisions that the Supreme Court makes about what the Constitution means that have turned out to be, by everyone's acknowledgement, horribly wrong. I mean, the Supreme Court endorsed racial segregation. It endorsed the internment of Japanese Americans. It endorsed the right of slave owners to capture slaves from fugitive territories. The Supreme Court has a whole history of engaging in not just politicized acts, but horrible acts that the Constitution was intended to prevent. So the Constitution is an imperfect document. There were lots of things that it left out that it should have included. There were things it included that shouldn't have been in there. And the execution of the rights that are guaranteed are quite imperfect as well, because we have to rely on human institutions. But the system is designed to allow the executive branch and allow the Congress to be as political as it wants to be. They are political branches. There are rules in place, at least to try and minimize the political influences of the Supreme Court, and I think you see lots of cases where right-wing judges rule against Republican politicians and liberal judges rule against Democratic politicians, because people are able to segregate legal analysis from political considerations. It doesn't always happen. Lots of times it's infected with politics. Now probably more so than ever before it is. But it's still a better way of protecting these rights than leaving them up purely to the political process.
So, I mean, kind of just a second question that I had, which I suppose you sort of started answering, which was, I mean, you say that the way this should be resolved is like kind of taking this out of the realm of politics or something like that. So is the Supreme Court the way you're, like, what you're proposing? Are you proposing something else? If so, what is that?
Well, I'm not sure I actually am proposing an alternative to the Supreme Court or a way to like.
What would you do?
I mean, I haven't actually sat down and thought honestly about how I can create this, better process for how constitutional rights can be vindicated. Other than, I mean, to be honest, just off the top of my head, it's kind of a heavy burden to impose off the top of your head, come up with a better system for protecting constitutional rights in the Supreme Court. But I think that it's in theory a fairly sensible way of doing it, which is to take people who have been inculcated with the idea that there's a certain form of reasoning that ought to be apolitical, and doing everything possible to insulate them from the political process, which most importantly of all is what life tenure is intended to do. People who are on the Supreme Court don't have to care about the reaction of the public to their decisions because they can't be removed from office except in the most extreme cases. They don't need Congress to like them because Congress and the Constitution is barred from reducing their salary in ways that would be punitive. So there are protections that are designed to insulate the court from politics. There are ways of educating lawyers and ultimately judges to make apolitical decisions, or at least as apolitical as possible. There probably are some things you could do. There's been cases where Supreme Court judges have refused to recuse themselves in cases where they were way too close to the parties or the interest involved, and maybe there's some Uber commission that can be created to take away the right of these judges to decide on their own when they should be recused. That might be something that could help the process, but by and large, I think at least in theory, having an apolitical branch, or one that's intended to be apolitical, is probably the best that we can do. Yep.
Yeah, you said, you mentioned how the Obama administration is refusing to prosecute Bush administration torture and other abuses. And I know we've signed, lots of treaties that are supposed to be the supreme law of the land, which say that we have to prosecute those. And I also know that international courts are supposed to have, universal jurisdiction over torture and things like that. So I was just wondering if you see any hope in the future for there to be accountability for the offenses of the Bush administration.
No. And that is again, I mean, that's a really horribly pessimistic and depressing thing to say, but I'm not sure what else I can say. I mean, the reality is that there's this really interesting New York Times article that exposed a truth that usually doesn't get spoken quite so explicitly. It was in January of 2009, like a week before Obama was inaugurated. And during the campaign, he was asked whether he would be amenable to investigations about whether war crimes had been committed. And he said, yes, he would absolutely be open-minded about that. He would instruct his attorney general to determine if there was evidence to suggest the commission of crimes and conduct a meaningful investigation. He, did his standard both sides argument. We don't want to criminalize political disputes, but at the same time, everyone is subject to the rule of law, and if laws are broken, then they should be prosecuted. But before he was even inaugurated, this was one of the promises that he abandoned. He didn't even wait until the inauguration like he did with most of the other ones. So he leaked to the New York Times through a couple of aides that he was actually opposed not only to prosecutions, but even to congressional investigations. And there was this article that said Obama reluctant to look into past crimes. And that, I think, was the emergence for the first time of the Orwellian mantra, we should look forward and not backwards, when it comes to the crimes of powerful political officials, at least. And one of the things it said in this article was that presidents are very reluctant to criminally investigate the acts of their predecessors because that might mean that their successors will criminally investigate their acts, which is another way of saying that there's basically a gentleman's agreement among presidents that they're all entitled to break the law because they won't investigate each other's crimes, and that Obama was essentially ensuring that he would be the continued beneficiary of this practice by insulating Bush officials from prosecution. As far as the international community is concerned, I mean, it's so obvious the way that works. You will have occasionally a war crimes prosecution of a dictator from Africa, or you'll have one who's, elderly and completely devoid of any power from a country that doesn't have much influence, like Pinochet, who ends up being prosecuted. But Western leaders are never brought before war crimes tribunals, and it's inconceivable that any leading American political official would be. And you actually see efforts by certain international factions like Spain, which has exerted theories of universal jurisdiction to prosecute Pinochet, that wanted to do so with regard to Bush officials, and yet WikiLeaks cables revealed that the Obama administration very early on engaged in strenuous efforts to dissuade Spanish authorities from conducting investigations, German authorities as well. They literally demanded that German and Spanish politicians intervene in their independent judiciaries to stop these investigations. So it is, it's simply inconceivable that in the international community where power is everything, that American political officials would ever be hauled before some sort of international tribunal, no matter how much treaties render that not only legitimate but mandatory. It's just not going to happen. Yep.
Hi. I'd like to first off just thank you for your work, Mr. Greenwald. Your voice in the national dialogue.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
It's really necessary and it's appreciated.
Thanks.
So my comment is, especially with the war on terror and civil liberties, much of the attention is always focused on the executive, on Bush and Obama. But to some extent, from a cynical view, it's almost expected that they make these moves that they do. They grab for more power. It's kind of in the nature of their branch from a cynical view. The judiciary, to me, is a little bit more disturbing, the role they've played in this. In many instances, they've not only been lockstep with this expansion into civil liberties violations, but have actually disregarded prior precedent or expanded prior doctrines. I'm thinking specifically of pleading standards and the state secrets privilege. Mm-hmm. So I was wondering if you could comment on to what extent you see the American judiciary actually enabling the executive branch and how inappropriate that is.
Well, I don't think your view is cynical at all. I mean, the idea that different branches would try and accumulate as much power as possible was one of the central assumptions of the American founding. I mean, that's just human nature, that people want to acquire for themselves as much power as possible, both because power is a good thing for people, because it lets them do what they want to do, and because they assume that powers that are vested in them will be exercised constructively because they're good people, unlike those people over there who are bad people and aren't trustworthy to have that power. So the whole idea of checks and balances and having different branches of government is that each branch would constantly be at war with one another, trying to acquire for itself as much power as possible. And through this struggle for power amongst the different branches would result a balance of power, that the executive would win some fights and lose some, Congress would win some and lose some, the judiciary would win some and lose some. And then there were other checks, too, that were designed to prevent any one faction, like the executive branch, from acquiring too much power or unchallengeable power, such as the Fourth Estate, the media, and ultimately the citizenry, which is supposed to be the last check. So the problem is exactly what you identified. It isn't just the courts, but all of these institutions, including the Congress, that completely abdicated its responsibility. It just completely withdrew from the fight and ceded everything to the executive. And you see this, for example, in the debate, which isn't really a debate except in very isolated precincts, over whether Obama had the authority to start the war in Libya without congressional authorization. You would think that, based on that theory that I've just articulated, that it would be Congress, rather than just a few people here and there outside of Congress, that would be the angriest. How dare President Obama encroach what is our area of responsibility under the Constitution, which is the power to declare war. And yet there was just an amendment introduced in the Senate by Rand Paul, which I think somewhat cleverly just simply took Obama's words from 2007 or 2008 that I had referenced earlier that said that presidents have no rights to start wars without congressional approval, and it failed 90 to 10. 90% of the Senate said, we don't have that power. It's the president who has that power. And you saw that continuously throughout the Bush administration as well, where there were all kinds of things the Bush administration did without congressional approval that it could have gotten congressional approval for because of how deferential the Congress was in the wake of 9/11, that they purposely chose to do without Congress just to create the principle that they don't need anyone's permission to do anything, and Congress completely acquiesce. So you're right that these transgressions on the part of the executive branch are not only their fault for breaking the law and violating their own duties, but the fault of the other branches, including Congress and the courts. The courts have actually been a little bit better, both lately and in comparison to the other intended checks, certainly better than Congress and way better than the media, and at least imposing some degree of restraints on what the president is authorized to do, even in the name of war. So it was Congress that declared the military commissions unconstitutional in 2006 in the Hamdan case because it lacked congressional authorization, and in Boumediene in 2008 they said that by a 5-4 decision denying Guantanamo detainees the right of habeas corpus, the way the Military Commissions Act did, was unconstitutional, and you can't put people into cages without at least giving them some ability to get into a court. So you've seen a little bit of pushback on the part of the courts, but by and large you're absolutely right that they have endorsed virtually every aspect of the assertions of these power, and there's no question that they bear a large portion of the blame. I don't accept the idea that when the executive branch transgresses its limits that they're not at fault because that's to be expected, because they also take an oath, first and foremost, not to defend the security of the United States, but to defend the Constitution. So when they break the Constitution, they're violating their own oath, just like Bradley Manning is accused of doing. So I think blame certainly lies first and foremost with the perpetrators of the transgressions. But you're right that these other institutions that are abdicating its responsibility to check that also bear a large part of the blame. Yep.
Last November, you had a pretty high-profile argument with Larry O'Donnell about the question of the elections, in which Larry O'Donnell repeated a lot of pundits' opinions that liberals lost the elections for the Democrats. And you pointed out that that simply wasn't true, that in many individual cases, that the country wasn't exactly moving right, that in many cases of individual policies, a majority of the country actually supported what was seen as the minority or the out-of-touch opinion. Particularly with regards to the civil liberties issue and with the closing of Guantanamo, that was the case. And like you pointed out in a recent blog post and today, Barack Obama was elected in 2008 on those stances. So I was wondering how you thought that those paradigms have been established in which it is seen as, you know, these particular policies are the minority's opinions or the elite's opinions, and then middle America, or the real America, as Sarah Palin would say, stand against those ideas, because a lot of people point out, just blame the media, but is it just the media or is there more to that?
Well, one of the things that's really interesting, there's this journalistic tick, I would call it. It's just kind of this like tactic that used to, for a long time, drive me absolutely insane with anger, that I would have to write about it every single time I saw it, no matter how repetitious I became and bored people with it. And I've pretty much become accustomed to it now, so I generally don't point it out any longer. But it's so incredibly common, which is journalists who insist that they are beacons of objectivity and are basically devoid of all opinions. They've risen to the mountain where they simply observe and report facts, and opinions are for the kind of rabble who are drowning in subjectivity. The way that they demonstrate this to be the case is they never will express an opinion as being their own. What they instead do is they take their opinions and they attribute them to majorities or to the American people. And the way that this tactic, the telltale sign of this tactic, is when somebody makes an assertion about what the majority of people believe without reference to any polling data whatsoever. Like, it would never occur to me, my brain would never allow me to write this sentence along the lines of most Americans believe or the majority support without linking or citing to some poll to demonstrate the truth of what I was saying. I mean, it's so reflexively necessary to do that. And yet, what journalists do all the time is they attribute their own opinions to majorities. And what they really do, and politicians do this too, is it's a way of manipulating public opinion. Pretending that you care about public opinion, but in reality trying to ignore it. And the way that works is that if you repeat enough times that the majority believes X, then people who believe X will start to conclude that they're actually in the minority, that most people actually disagree with them, and that all decent, good people, all serious people, realize that X is wrong. And you will almost always then start to see a shift in public opinion based upon these declarations. I can't tell you how many times I've seen where majorities of Americans support a particular policy that the Washington class, the pundit class, and the political class dislike, and simply by either agreeing that X is wrong or by deceitfully asserting that X is not supported by the majority, it starts to shift. I talked about your closing Guantanamo, you mentioned. I talked earlier about the eavesdropping scandal, about prosecutions of Bush officials. You see this all the time. It's a way of basically pretending that you are basing your view on what the public wants while deceitfully representing what that is, and that has the effect of actually shifting it to what it is that you want. It's a pretty pernicious process because it really is a way of marginalizing what majorities want.
Thank you.
Yep. We have time for, I think, 2 more questions, one here and one here.
This is very different than what we've been talking about, but since you are a constitutional lawyer and a strong advocate of civil liberties, and since we are talking about denial of civil liberties, this should be a question you're comfortable with. Do you think there's a constitutional right to marriage equality?
I mean, I believe in marriage equality 100%, and in fact, marriage equality is probably the issue that has the worst personal effect on me. It's the reason I can't live in this country with my partner, so I have a great personal investment in that issue, aside from a strong political belief that it's disgraceful not to allow marriage equality. Having said that, and it's probably evident by that throat clearing and those caveats, that I actually am somewhat ambivalent about whether the Constitution prohibits the government, if it chooses, from granting marital equality rights only to opposite-sex couples. I think there's a very good argument to make, and actually, when I was still practicing law, made this argument around 14 years ago, and lost, that the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment is violated by singling out certain citizens and saying that the marriages that they want to enter into are illegal and not recognized. At the same time, if you look at every single factor that you can use to interpret the Constitution, obviously the original intent is one, not the only factor. The lack of explicit language in the Constitution that has anything to do with marital rights, the history of allowing states to define them. I also think that the case for arguing that there is no constitutional right for marital equality is reasonable. I probably am ultimately persuaded that there is, but I don't think it's a clear case, and I would vastly prefer to see the citizenry come to the conclusion on its own that marital equality is the right idea, and I think that will happen.
Just to follow up on that, the reason I think that original intent is a completely invalid way of looking at the Equal Protection Clause is because it's obvious that the framers of the 14th Amendment certainly didn't think that it mandated desegregation, and yet clearly Brown v. Board of Education and all the decisions that followed are constitutional and just decisions.
I mean, original intent is an absolute farce when it's held up as the dispositive standard. And the reason for that is because the founders were pretty humble about their abilities to foresee the future. And not only were they humble, but they also knew that they were incapable of describing principles in a way that would be clear about how they should be applied in the future, and they knew that they were imperfect human beings who would violate their own principles, not because they were hypocrites, but because we're imperfect human beings and violate our own principles. So the fact that the founders consecrated certain principles and at the same time engaged in certain acts that were inconsistent with those principles doesn't mean that you have to interpret those principles as allowing the violations. So I don't at all think that original intent is the dispositive or overriding factor. I think it's one factor. It has to be a factor because if you want to ask what a document means, what the meaning of a principle is, it would be inconceivable to bracket out of the equation, bracket out of the analysis, what the people who espoused the principle and codified it understood it to mean. I mean, that would have to be relevant, but it's not overarching, or certainly not the only one. Yep.
So I was interested about your point when you said that that journalists tend not to pay attention to even important violations when neither of the two major parties are really raising it as an important issue. And I was wondering about what techniques you think are good for establishing some kind of group or movement or collective action that can have the kind of legitimacy to speak out on these things and make them make pressure on the governments to change them, and to continue raising them as an issue, even when the parties want to keep it outside of these kind of issues, outside of the general consensus. And I really like your work. I'm glad that you are good at criticizing these violations of rights, but I wanted to know what you thought would be good to do would you actually support that you see people doing or that might be done to establish this kind of legitimate alternative? And as you said, you were recommending cross-partisan and cross-ideological alliances, but I don't see exactly what kind of thing that you would recommend that would have the ideological flexibility to, like a coalition, and ideological flexibility to not just be appealing to one part in the political spectrum, like say Fire Dog Lake, because Fire Dog Lake is not going to change people all by itself, but something that will has a flexibility to accommodate people from different parts of the political spectrum, and yet show some degree of unity in pressing for defending the most important civil liberties.
Right.
So I wanted to know what kind of thoughts you had about what you would support, what you would positively be speak in favor of.
Okay. So, I think that, and I'm glad that you asked this question because I've been so dark and dreary the whole night that I'm actually glad to be able to end the discussion on somewhat of an optimistic note, at least compared to everything I've said up until this point. I actually am somewhat encouraged by the ability of technologies to change the political dynamic and the way political power is exercised. I mean, I think even from the time that I began writing, which is only about 5 years ago, until now, I see major discernible differences in the ability of different voices to shape political discussions. I think the internet has really begun to fulfill one of its central promises of democratizing political discussion, because you can now command large amounts of attention and develop significant platforms without having to work within corporate structures. I mean, it really was the case that as recently as 7 or 8 years ago, the only voices that would get heard on the political stage were ones that worked for large media corporations. And now, you could remain completely outside of those media corporations and have a serious impact on the political process. I mean, the reality is the Bradley Manning story, for example, which just caused a huge controversy when the State Department spokesman resigned because he protested the treatment of Bradley Manning, and the president was then forced to defend it, and it made every national news show and every Sunday show, was an issue that originated and developed among blogs, including the one that you mentioned. I was the first person to write about Bradley Manning's detention conditions. Had this been 3 years ago, I could have written about it every single day, or even 4 or 5 years ago. I could have written about it every single day, and it could have been completely ignored. But now blogging and internet technologies have democratized these voices and have amplified them in a way that they can make a much better impact. And you see this in lots of different cases. And all you need to do is to look at what has happened in the Middle East over the course of the past 3 months. And this is, why I say I'm ending on an optimistic note, because, one of the things that I've always tried to balance, and it's difficult to balance, is that if you are a writer who generally is critical of most political institutions and both political parties, the danger is that you can spread defeatism and resignation. If you're constantly criticizing the major political institutions, the media outlets, identifying deficiencies in mainstream political thought, it can become so overwhelming at some point that lots of people just finally conclude that it's too powerful, it's too all-consuming, and there's nothing that can really be done about it. And I've argued against that all the time. I've always argued just in theory that any structure or institution created by human beings, no matter how invulnerable or powerful it seems, can always be torn down or modified or replaced by other human beings. History proves that over and over and over again, that even the most seemingly invulnerable power factions have been undermined and subverted even quite rapidly. And if it's not happening, it's not because it's impossible. It's because the people who want it to happen just haven't figured out how to make it happen. And concluding that it's impossible or that it just is too overwhelming is really nothing more than a way of relieving oneself of the burden of having to figure out how that should be done and then doing the work to make it happen. And you can say that in the abstract and people might agree with it in principle, but it's still hard to convince people that when you talk about things like the entrenched consortium of government and corporate power that runs the national security state, that can really be meaningfully subverted. And what the events in the Middle East do, and the reason why I find them so significant, is because here you have dictatorships that have been so entrenched for decades. And they're entrenched for all sorts of reasons. The population is kept poor and powerless, often uneducated. The governments are subservient to Western powers, especially the United States and Israel, and therefore are lavish with weapons and money to stay in power. And yet, literally overnight, one after the next was torn down, destroyed, eliminated by nothing more than very ordinary citizens gathering together in large numbers and forcing that to happen, using kind of, some technologies, but by and large doing it through nothing more than freedom of assembly and citizen activism. And so if the people of Egypt and Tunisia and Bahrain and Yemen can literally take the most powerful factions in their country that are so entrenched and tear it down in a very short period of time, that ought to forever prevent anyone in this country with its resources and its abilities from believing that anything is impossible when it comes to not incremental but radical political change. And so, whenever people ask me, what can be done about it? I mean, my answer always is that just right now we are doing something about it. I mean, the reason why what happened in the Middle East happened is because enough people got convinced that the government was so corrupt and was so irreversibly destructive that they were willing to risk their lives in order to bring it down. And so that ultimately is how power ends up being subverted and destroyed, which is that the citizens who are captive to and subject to that power decide that they are no longer willing to tolerate its excesses. And you see that in the United States in sort of incipient ways. If you look at polling, you see that enormous numbers of people find most political institutions, most institutions in general, to be untrustworthy and to be worthy of contempt and not respect. You see lots of very deep-seated anxiety over the future of the United States, the first time ever that large numbers of people believe that we're actually in decline as a country, which is an extraordinary thing for Americans who have always believed we're exceptional, to actually start to realize. You clearly see the belief that economic security is being rapidly eroded, not just for themselves, but for their children and grandchildren, while the wealthiest and powerful continue to plunder and get rich. And so the more this kind of sentiment becomes intensified, and I think it inevitably will, because there are far too few resources to distribute to prevent it from happening, and the resources that are being distributed are going to the tiny segment and being kept away from large numbers of Americans. It's that kind of disenchantment that can cause reform that at one minute seems unthinkable and impossible, and the next minute becomes a reality. So I think the thing that everybody, when you say what can we do, I think what can we do is to continue to communicate with our fellow citizens as much as possible and persuade them as effectively as we can that these kind of reforms are necessary. And that means gathering together like this. It means using technologies like the internet. It means exercising the freedoms that we started off talking about, like freedom of speech and assembly and freedom of the press, to continue to disseminate these ideas. And once these ideas are disseminated, I mean, the rest just sort of happens spontaneously. American history has lots of examples where those kinds of very positive changes that seemed inconceivable one minute actually happen the next. The Middle East provides that template, and I think that's always how it gets done, is through the realization on the part of the citizenry that those kind of changes are not just desirable, but so necessary that they're willing to sacrifice in order to make them happen. So thank you very much again. Appreciate it.